Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we break down the chaos in Syria and what it means for U.S. national security. And we dive into the nomination of Jared Isaacman to lead NASA and the coming boom of the space economy. And then Guy Taylor has an exclusive interview from the Reagan National Defense Forum with Steve Blank, co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A great show for you this week with a lot of exclusive content and on-the-ground reporting from both myself and from Guy. Guy, you were just at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California a few days ago. I'm coming to you from Orlando, Florida, where I'm attending the Space Power 2024 conference here. And later in the show, Guy has a great conversation from the Reagan Defense Forum with Steve Blank, co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. So great stuff coming up there. But before we get to that, as always, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week. Off the top, I, like everyone else, am blown away by what's happened in Syria, where the Assad dictatorship that has wielded power over one of the most geographically strategic stretches of the Middle East since 1971. That's 53 years, Ben. It was sacked and ousted in a matter of days last weekend. Bashar Assad is now in exile in Russia. The regime is no more. There are so many angles to what's happened in Syria. I want to break it down into three basic bites. First, who's in power right now? The militant group that led the sacking of Damascus is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is a Sunni Muslim group that was once aligned with al-Qaeda, and it's been on the official U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations since 2014, Ben. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, has said it is appointing a man named Mohammed al-Bashir to form a transitional government. There are more questions than answers, though. The situation remains fluid. Could Syria become a democracy? Maybe. But it could also easily collapse back into civil war, like the one that burned for more than a decade between the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings and last weekend. And jihadist extremist factions could be fighting each other all over the place in the country. Second basic bite here, Ben, why did this happen now? It happened because the Assad regime's backers, Iran, Russia, and the Iran-backed Shiite militant group Hezbollah, got weakened. Russia by its war in Ukraine, Iran and Hezbollah by waves of Israeli airstrikes. Hezbollah is on its knees, and HTS saw the moment to make its move on the Assad regime. Third basic bite, what comes next and why does it matter for the United States? We don't know what happens next. My read is that the Sunni Muslim Gulf Arab powers, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, others, maybe also nearby Turkey, will try to back a transition government and help HTS achieve it. But the danger is very real that Islamic extremists will seize the moment of combustibility to seek a resurrection of the Islamic State Caliphate in Syria, where roughly 1,000 U.S. forces are currently deployed to prevent just that from happening. A note, Ben, Army General Michael E. Kurilla, the top official in the U.S. military's entire Mideast operation, has actually visited several bases inside Syria in the days since the Assad regime's ouster. If U.S. forces get drawn into deeper engagement in Syria, it could derail President-elect Donald Trump's desire to untangle them from the region and pursue a more robust American presence in the Indo-Pacific to counter China's military expansion there.
Guy, do you think will there be a similar behind the scenes pressure as we saw during the first Trump administration from folks inside the Pentagon and in national security circles who pushed back on Donald Trump in his attempt to pull troops out of Syria? Do you think this crisis and the uncertainty there could lead to a similar push from generals and other officials? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's already manifesting itself, that there are gains that have been made with the crushing of the ISIS caliphate in Raqqa several years ago. And there's a feeling in the Pentagon that the United States doesn't want to lose those gains. A resurgence of this group would be disastrous for the region and for global security, regional security, as well as for U.S. ally Israel. One thing that's notable, Ben, is that Trump tweeted about the situation as it was unfolding right before Damascus was falling. And he basically said, "This is not America's problem. Don't get involved." So we have to imagine how that message was received by special operators on the ground, U.S. forces that are already in Syria. So let me shift gears, though, Ben. I want to look at the Indo-Pacific, because another thing on my radar is that Donald Trump has invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to attend his inauguration on January 20th. It's unclear whether Xi will accept, but this is very interesting given that Trump made the invitation essentially a major diplomatic olive branch, even while keeping up his threat to impose massive new tariffs on China. That is a threat that undergirds the narrative that U.S. China tensions are likely to soar during the coming Trump administration. China's threats to the U.S. backed island democracy of Taiwan are at the center of that narrative, Ben. And it's notable that China has actually increased its military exercises again in waters off Taiwan in recent days. What caught my eye is that while there is significant evidence of these exercises occurring, Beijing is being very quiet about it right now, rather than boasting about it, making public threats, which Chinese officials have done during past military drills near Taiwan. We're tracking that in the Threat Status newsletter, Ben. Finally, I was at the Reagan National Defense Forum in Simi Valley, north of Los Angeles, California, at the start of this past week. It's an amazing convergence of national security officials and executives from private defense and tech companies. I was struck at this year's forum, a notoriously hawkish, Reagan-esque peace through strength gathering. I was struck by how open and basically excited that the establishment Republican crowd at the forum seemed to be about the coming Trump administration, which itself is seen to be a buck to the establishment. We're going to get into that in our feature interview in a few minutes, Ben, with Steve Blank, who I spoke with at the Reagan Forum.
Yeah, there's a sense of excitement here too, as well at the Space Power Conference in Orlando, Florida. So it's really interesting how those winds are shifting. Was there anything at the Reagan National Defense Forum, Guy, that just absolutely blew your mind? Because it's known as there's a lot of obviously groundbreaking technology companies involved there. Did anything really grab your attention?
One of the cool things about Reagan Defense Forum is all the meetings that go on the sidelines of the panels with top Pentagon officials. So Threat Status had a bunch of meetings with people from cool futuristic companies. One was with Shield AI, and they told us about the AI piloted drone they're making. Ben, they say that it can circumnavigate the Earth without using GPS. This sort of blew my mind because it means this drone has a brain packed with what I would describe as almost semi-sentient AI computer chips that read the drone's environment, celestial positioning, for instance, as well as the atmosphere and topography, and then are able to identify its location and then make decisions about where to fly without having any human at the joystick. Imagine a fleet of thousands of such drones, Ben. That's coming. The global security space is changing dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, one of the coolest things that I saw here at the Space Power Conference also deals with AI. It's this thing called the XC3 platform, which is sort of informally known as the digital spaceport of the future. This project was being displayed here on a massive, basically a movie theater size screen. It's a collaborative project of the companies XRDNA, BluesTack, Silotech, and Immersive FX. And essentially the way they pitched the project to me and to the folks here at the conference is that it's an AI co-pilot for a member of the U.S. military for their entire life. It stays with them. It assists in data analysis. It recognizes an individual's patterns, learns the kind of information they want to see, the kinds that they typically disregard when they're making decisions, makes personal recommendations for them based on their history, and will essentially be with them for their entire career. The idea is you can access this basically anywhere in the world, and you'll have this digital AI companion that will essentially know as much or more about you as any other human being that you're serving with, and give you all the data that you could possibly need to do whatever job in the military it is that you have at that given moment. So it's mind-blowing, also AI related, because it's going to change the way decisions are made up and down the military if and when it's implemented on a large scale.
What's wild to me about this, Ben, and I felt this at Reagan Defense, is like the extent to which these technologies are going to be harnessed by the U.S. government, the U.S. military, or are they going to end up in the hands of private mercenary militias? Imagine Russia's Wagner group had this technology.
You think it's inevitable that they would, right? I mean, this stuff doesn't stay in one party's hands forever. No, that's a concern. Next week here in the show, speaking of the Space Power Conference, I will have an exclusive interview with Bill Wolf. He's a retired Air Force colonel who is now the president of the Space Force Association, which is the nonprofit group that advocates for and supports the United States Space Force. A lot of the companies here at the conference, big and small, are members of the SFA. One of the things that jumped out to me here, Guy, is just how far the Space Force and the private industry around it has come in a very short period of time. You remember, and our listeners probably do as well, this was just stood up as a military service back in 2019 during the first Trump administration, and it was a punchline on late night TV. I can remember Jimmy Kimmel and other folks essentially making fun of it, showing Star Wars clips and mocking Mike Pence for talking about the United States Space Force, and yet here we are 5 years later, and it's not only a well-respected military service, it's doing critical work for our national security every day all around the world. One of the biggest headlines to me was the speech by Jared Isaacman, the billionaire and entrepreneur and commercial astronaut picked by Donald Trump to be the next NASA administrator. Isaacman was booked for this conference, Guy, long before the announcement last week that Trump wants him to lead NASA.
I want to point out a detail before you continue, Ben. I was trying to verify this, but when we talk about space, I think contextually, our listeners should understand that there are more than 11,300 satellites orbiting the Earth right now, and that was actually about a 38% increase from a year prior to that. So the number is going up, and space is a domain that is understood to just be critical at this point in the future of U.S. defense, global security.
And those numbers are going to go up exponentially. And that's why you have, like, for example, I spoke to some folks with Amazon down here, and their next major project is going to be launching thousands of satellites into orbit. Incorporated into that is a plan to deorbit those satellites when they outlive their usefulness. Because if we don't start doing that, the space up there, no pun intended, is going to be literally too crowded to operate in effectively. So that's a huge, important part of this story. Jared Isaacman's an important part of this story as well. Now, this guy, he made a fortune with his online payment provider Shift4, but he's probably best known as part of the Polaris Dawn space mission, a 5-day mission back in September that was the first commercial spacewalk in history. No government involvement with this one. They reached the highest altitude any human has ever reached since the Apollo era, 870 miles. They flew in a Dragon spacecraft, which is made by, you guessed it, Elon Musk's SpaceX. Even the spacesuits they wore were designed by SpaceX. So Musk is a part of the conversation again on the podcast, as he seems to be every week. And let's be clear, though, Guy, I think that's probably a big part of the reason Trump picked Isaacman for the job. Right now, the NASA administrator is Bill Nelson, former astronaut, longtime U.S. senator from Florida. That's a more traditional NASA chief. Isaacman isn't that by any stretch of the imagination. He's as deep in the commercial side of the space industry as just about anybody else in a position of power in America today, except for maybe Elon Musk himself. And that's really important because I think the biggest big picture takeaway for me this week at this conference is how private industry, whether it's SpaceX, Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos, or any other company, These companies are now launching rockets, putting humans into space, doing a bunch of other jobs that used to be reserved for NASA and the contractors working directly under the authority of the federal government. That's no longer the case. Jared Isaacman talked about how humans are inevitably going to have a presence on the moon and eventually Mars, and mining projects in space in which VC and private equity firms look to make billions of dollars by extracting precious metals. These projects aren't going to be done just by NASA, right, Guy? I mean, there's a space economy being built right now.
On my way to the Reagan National Defense Forum, I stopped at a company called VAST, which is a little bit south of Los Angeles, a little past Long Beach, where they are scrambling to make what is proposed to be a rebuild of the International Space Station. Totally private company, totally. So very, very interesting. I mean, that's right there in California. I saw the design of it again. You can find that on threat status at the Washington Times.
Yeah, that's where we're headed. I mean, there's companies here on display that are, building all kinds of things that will help for refueling in space, or, relaunch, all kinds of capabilities to essentially, let's be honest, both help U.S. space exploration and space dominance and national security, and also to help companies make money. And that's really at the heart of this. And Jared Isaacman is uniquely positioned along with Elon Musk to see that happen. So that's where we're headed in space, Guy. Isaacman understands that as well as anybody. And I think that's why he got tapped for the job. So with all that in mind, let's get to your conversation here with Steve Blank.
Steve Blank is the co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. Steve is with me here at the 2024 Reagan National Defense Forum at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in sun-drenched Simi Valley, California. Steve, thanks for joining me. First and foremost, tell me about the Gordian Knot Center and what you're doing.
Thanks for having me. The Gordian Knot Center at Stanford is just a realization that three things are unique to the area and to Stanford. One is we're the center of all the advanced technology in the United States, whether it's AI or drones or cyber or biotech, etc. All exist within a 50-mile radius. Obviously exists in other places in the country, but still over 85% of all the advanced innovation is happening here. Two is we invented the rapid innovation processes that all startups and large companies now use, which is slowly percolating through the DoD. And three is we have world-class faculty in policy, national security, and students to match in both engineering and policy. And we thought that Venn diagram was just missing in a single center. World-class centers for technology, world-class centers for policy, but no three of those things have ever come together before.
We're here at Reagan Defense. What do you make of the mood here at this year's Reagan Forum? This is a very bipartisan gathering, but it's somewhat famously known as also a very establishment Republican national security event, the big peace through strength gathering of the year. Of course, the incoming Trump administration, J.D. Vance and others, they publicly espouse more of a libertarian posture. Critics might even call it isolationist. What's your read of the mood here at the Reagan Forum with regard to Trump as the incoming commander-in-chief?
Well, the mood here is at least half the people are looking for new jobs. So, I always thought of this place as more of a gathering of the who's who of the Defense Department and companies that support them and policymakers, etc. Very interesting, and misses almost no representation from state or any of the other players that are important to our national security. Less so politics, meaning we support who's ever the president of the United States, and I think people are thinking about what opportunities will the new administration allow us to build a more safe and secure country.
Steve, you've written that this current moment in which China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are converging against the United States globally is critical for the defense industry. Many say China right now has actually surpassed America in terms of military industrial production capabilities. Some are calling for massive shifts in the Pentagon acquisition process, the whole setup of how the U.S. produces weapons. What needs to be done with regard to that with this incoming administration?
What needs to be done starts with a couple of observations. One is we still have world-class people, world-class organizations in the Department of Defense. Unfortunately, it's for a world that no longer exists. And that's a big idea because on a normal day, China's operating at the speed of Silicon Valley, and maybe the DoD with a tailwind operates like General Motors. That worked fine when our adversaries were ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Doesn't work fine when not only it's 2 plus 3, but it's 2 plus many right now. And it also just misses the fact that for the last 5 years, the national security commercial side has exploded in terms of number of companies, amount of money invested, etc. And the DoD acquisition process has just not kept up with the fact that there's a whole new ecosystem willing and able to contribute to national security. And the more we kind of delay our ability to integrate that, the further behind we have, because both Russia and China have adopted a whole-of-nation approach to their national security, integrating all parts of commercial technology and efforts into their national security efforts. And so I propose something that we actually did in World War II. In World War II, people remember the number of bombers and fighters and ships. We went from 6 carriers to 105, hundreds of thousands of aircraft, etc. But the other part of that was execution of known things we knew how to build, though they were obviously massive efforts. B-29 project took more money and people than the Manhattan Project. But the other side that people forget is all the advanced technologies were not built by the military. And this was something no other country did. A senior scientist named Vannevar Bush went to Roosevelt before the war and said, this is going to be a technology war, and the military is incapable of actually building advanced weapon systems.
Do you see Elon Musk's pursuit of Donald Trump as the kind of contemporary manifestation of that?
Elon is one of many. I would put him on the top of the most visible. Trey Stevens at Founders Fund, Mike Brown and Ross Shaw at Shield Capital, Doug Beck, who runs the Defense Innovation Unit. But the key idea is all the advanced weapon systems, radar, electronic warfare, a small physics program, which they ran for 2 years until it got so big they called it the Manhattan Project and spun it out. Will all run, you ready for this, by professors and universities who recruited their top graduate students. So 10,000 of them worked on advanced weapon systems.
You're really talking about the war production, the Rooseveltian War Production Board. Is that right?
No, the War Production Act actually made the tanks and the guns and the planes. So that was execution of like existing things we kind of had on the books, and we knew what this was. Crazy things. This was like the most advanced technology that was barely like even in the mind of most of them. It's not that we didn't have Naval Research Lab and other things, but nothing at scale. The equivalent today would be taking unmanned drones and underwater drones and whatever. Yeah, we have exquisite, we could build 10. We need 10,000, maybe 10,000 a month.
That sounds like what's happening with the replicator program at the Pentagon. You're shaking your head now, but you've actually, first of all, is that happening with the replicator program? And then second of all, you've written about the need for what you call the Office of Rapid Development and Deployment. What is that? Is that and how could that actually come about?
Let's tie a couple of things together. Replicator is a great idea from Kath Hicks that says we need unmanned vehicles to essentially build a hybrid fleet for a Navy that doesn't want to do that. And so we said, let's buy all this stuff. Unfortunately, it runs into our own acquisition system. Those things aren't going to show up until they go through the POM and then become programs of record, and that takes years, if not decades. We don't have, if we believe 2027 or some number to deter a war in the Indo-PACOM is important, we need rapid deployment, not just innovation theater, we need innovation deployed. And the best way to do that, I believe, is to set up a separate department. Potentially, remember this thing in World War II didn't report to Congress or the military. It reported directly to the President of the United States. And while the other systems, the planes and guns, etc., were reporting to the military and economic push, this Advanced Weapon Systems group reported to the President. We could do the same today. We could outsource all these things that are better done by startups, whether it's AI or quantum or drones and whatever, and give it an acquisition authority of maybe 15% of the RDT&E budget, which would be $40 billion, and also give the COCOMs, or combatant commands, direct authority to actually buy from these agencies. Right now, they have to buy from the services in the same process that we need attritable drones, goes through the same process of buying an aircraft carrier.
So is this something that can be done with an executive order, or does it need legislation from Congress? And in MAGA world, is there an appetite for it? Is there actually momentum?
If there's an appetite for A, rapid change, B, making things more effective, and C, actually defending the country, and that's what the Reagan Conference is about, in a better and more efficient way. You know, my test for all kinds of proposals is, could this be worse than what we're doing now? And the answer is, you know, there's enough evidence here that says all the pieces are together for kind of a breakthrough in our thinking about how do we acquire and how do we deploy advanced technology at scale. And that's the part that we're missing. We do a ton of innovation theater, but very little innovation delivery.
What you're talking about is kind of a ramped up fusion between the national security community and the private sector. Even if there's momentum for this in the coming Trump administration, is the Pentagon flexible enough to embrace it in 2025, 2026? And is the private sector in the United States really capable of delivering on it? What are the challenges?
So those are a series of great questions. One is, you know, the world is kind of split between people who are awesome at execution, doing the same thing repeatedly, incrementally doing innovation on top of existing platforms and weapon systems. And in peacetime, that's exactly what you need. Those are the people we mostly have in place. But there's another half that needs to go on if we want to win, and those are people who see over the horizon, who see what's possible. And in fact, in the commercial world, we call that an ambidextrous organization. It's a $20 word for a 2-cent idea, which says you could chew gum and walk at the same time. In peacetime, you really don't. Those end up in your research labs, and that's kind of nice to have. Those are the crazy people in the corner. In a crisis or a wartime, that's what you want to have. And in the commercial world, we say, execution pays your salary, innovation pays your pension. And in the DoD, innovation will help you win those wars. To answer your question about will leadership in the DoD support this, well, the good news about the new administration is they get to appoint parts of the leadership that either will support it or if this is something the president wants, will probably be a retired somebody. And this breaks the status quo. The question is, does it better our defense posture or does it make it worse? And I think if you look at the long-term cost of how we're acquiring systems versus what's going on in Ukraine and how far behind we are in Indo-Pacific, it certainly can't be worse than what we're doing. We are really in deep trouble.
Let's talk about why all this matters geopolitically a little bit more. In the post 9/11 era and really just the first quarter of the 21st century, the U.S. has been militarily focused on the Middle East. Right now, the challenge seems to be how to shift to the Indo-Pacific, where competition with China is surging. Of course, we've been talking about this since the Obama administration's famed pivot to Asia. Has the U.S. failed at that pivot, and why does it matter?
Well, you know, it goes all the way back to the last major change in U.S. defense thinking was when General Mattis came out with a national defense strategy and articulated it was time for 2+3. So the good news is it got us off the focus of primarily we're fighting non-nation states to the fact that we were back in great nation competition, great power competition. But the world's changed since then, and our strategy really hasn't been updated. I mean, think about it: 50,000 North Korean troops in Ukraine. Our adversaries are collaborating in a way that our 2+3 strategy, even though we're focused on China, there are other places in the world that they realize that they could put pressure on us as well. And we are running out of bandwidth and time. That is, the other problem is the DoD thinks of its budget as a zero-sum game. You want drones or a hybrid fleet in Indo-Pacific? Guess what Huntington Ingalls is going to say? It's like, wait a minute, that's another carrier that's going to go away. There's no way they're going to let that go unless we figure out how do we drop virtual hundreds of billions of dollars into the DoD budget? And that's also been a lack of imagination. How do we use private equity at scale? What kind of tax breaks do they need to build those new shipyards or drone yards or whatever? We've just not figured out how to get private industry and private capital, not just venture capital, but all parts of our economic engine engaged in national security. We used to do this in the United States. We used to, in fact, realize it was a whole of nation competition, and we've now kind of just outsourced it to DoD, you figure it out, and we're going to do social media and everything else. we could get the country back aligned to the challenges in front of us if we're just use a little more imagination and creativity. And the good news is we're great at that. And this administration has brought in some people who actually know how to build things at scale.
The question, I think, is whether or not politics and media politics in Washington can embrace these ideas and not create a storm against them. And what are your thoughts on that? Is there bipartisanship on some of these issues of privatization when it comes to military industrial production capabilities?
You know, immediately you used a trigger word, which is privatization. I tend to think of it as a different word, which is a force multiplier. That is, if you try to think about privatization in the military, well, gee, that instinctually doesn't sound good. But if you think about using commercial companies as a force multiplier to the military we already have, now that gets very interesting. No one's saying get rid of carriers or aircraft or whatever. We're saying how can we add additional capabilities to a military that understands they need them, but literally is held hostage by its own acquisition process. Of course, people are going to go like a little ballistic about something that's uncomfortable and something that's new and something that breaks a lot of rice bowls of a lot of people and companies. Probably the biggest people will be the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, where historically they wanted line item control. And in fact, this is a staffer problem in those organizations, because the first time forever we're going to be thinking about using portfolio purchasing. Oh, gee, I need to be control of everything. Though no one's ever asked them, how's that working out with the F-35 or Ford-class carriers or all the other things you thought you had line item control over? We also need to be having new thinking in Congress as well. And the good news is, when I talk to people in the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, they know we can't go on like this, at least if we want to be a great power. I think people are looking for big ideas that don't diminish our ability to project power, but in fact increase it. And this is one idea. It's not the idea, but it's one idea, and we need many ideas like this. And hopefully this will allow us to think outside the boxes we built for ourselves. This country has painted itself in its own corner that it doesn't want to be standing in, and that's ludicrous. These rules weren't handed down on tablets. Human beings made these policies and procedures, and we could simply change them, and we should change them for the better of the defense of the nation and protection of the Western world.
Steve Blank, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast. Amazing, insightful, really interesting. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. So, Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My Threat of the Week, Ben, is that there could be a major disruption of some kind at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We saw this week that current FBI Director Christopher Wray, who originally was appointed by Donald Trump in Trump's first time around in the presidency, but has a big falling out with Trump. They do not like each other at all. He has announced that he will resign before Trump is inaugurated. This is somewhat historic, Ben. Listeners can read about it on Threat Status at the Washington Times. It had initially appeared that Wray would stay on and transfer power of the Bureau to a Trump nominee, in this case, Kash Patel, an unconventional pick to run the FBI if Patel is confirmed. But now we're looking at a situation where there won't be such a smooth transfer. There will be an interim director. My threat of the week, Ben, is that this could trigger an exodus of FBI officials. Whether or not that happens and what the impact it would have on federal law enforcement and crime and counterintelligence, all of that remains to be seen.
Guy, my threat of the week is unidentified drones. Now, listeners have probably been tracking the latest twist in this saga, which is mysterious unmanned aircraft flying over New Jersey and some in Maryland, apparently, as well. Lawmakers and even New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy are pretty concerned about this, especially because of the drones' proximity to New Jersey military bases and not far from President-elect Donald Trump's estate in Bedminster, New Jersey, as well. Representative Jeff Van Drew And New Jersey Republicans said this week that the drones could be flying in from an Iranian mothership out in the ocean. The Pentagon said there is no such ship, but if it's not an Iranian mothership, what are these things? This is becoming a huge issue because earlier this year we had a drone swarm flying over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. No official explanation for that. The most recent report from the Pentagon's UFO office said there were at least 18 instances recently of drones flying over sensitive U.S. nuclear sites. What were they doing? Taking photos, videos? We're not exactly sure. Congressman Van Drew has subsequently said maybe they're being flown by China. Whatever the case, I think he's right in raising questions about the fact that these drones seem to be flying in from the coast of New Jersey. There are a lot of drone hobbyists out there, Guy, but I don't know of many hobbyists that could fly a drone swarm in from the ocean over one of the most densely populated states in America and apparently evade detection, especially now, or evade identification, I guess I should say, especially now with everyone looking for them. So this is a threat right now for two reasons quickly. One, we don't know what they are, what their intentions are. And two, last year on the heels of the spy balloon allegedly flown by China over the U.S. military started shooting down UFOs in American skies. We all probably remember the chaos on Super Bowl Sunday in February 2023 when U.S. and Canadian authorities were tracking, quote, cylindrical, unquote, objects in the sky that made me wonder if we were in fact being invaded by aliens. So this story is getting more troubling and confusing by the day, Guy, and that's why it's my threat of the week.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, Ben, what's going on with this New Jersey drone situation. We covered it in Threat Status. There's a big hearing on it on Capitol Hill while you were down there in Orlando, and I encourage listeners to check that out. You can find it easily by Googling Threat Status, the Washington Times.
Listeners know this is an important issue to me personally, so we'll certainly keep an eye on it here at Threat Status. Thank you, Guy. Huge thanks to Steve Blank for coming on the show this week, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.